The Duke said it on a Tuesday, in front of the harbour master, 2 customs men, and a boy of 12 who was supposed to be sweeping the dock. He said it about Tabitha Salt, who was on her knees on the wet stone. Gutting a cod, she heard every word, she did not stop, the knife went in just below the jaw, clean and straight, the way her father had taught Herb one his bone, gut his gut, never let the blade wander. The cod was a good one, 3 pounds at least. Caught that morning. She had paid 4 pence for it and would sell it dressed for 7. The arithmetic of her life ran on margins like that, thin as the edge of the knife. And she had learned long ago not to look up from it when men with clean boots stopped to make observations. God help the man who weds a fishwife. The Duke of Foscote had said, "Hell find his bed sheet smell of the sea forever." The harbour master had laughed. The customs men had laughed. The boy with the broom had tried not to and failed. Tabby set the dressed fish on the ice, wiped her blade on the cloth tucked into her apron strings, and reached for the next one. By spring, she was holding their son, but that is the end of the story, and stories must be told from the beginning. The light went out of the harbour at 4:30 in December, and by the time Tabby had settled her account with the ice seller, packed her unsold stock into the salting crate, and rolled her tools into their oilcloth. The cobblestones were the color of a dead mackerel and the wind off the water had teeth in it. She sat on the low stool behind her stall and took out the knife that it was her father's, had been her father's, a gutting knife with a blade ground down to 3 inches by 20 years of sharpening in a hand. Look, carved from a piece of sperm whale jaw that some Kesterly fisherman had hauled up decades ago and sold to a bone carver for 6 pence. Daniel Salt had bought the finished knife for a shilling, used it every day for the rest of his life, and left it to Tabby along with a canvas-wrapped notebook. A set of debts, and the knowledge of what a fish's gills could tell you if you knew how to look. She cleaned the blade now the same way he had taught her, cloth from spine to tip, never across, 3 passes. Check the edge by the remaining light. The knife was older than she was. It would outlast her too, probably. If she was careful with it. She wrapped it in the cloth and laid it on top of the notebook. Her father's notebook was not beautiful. He had not been a beautiful writer. The pages were dense with small cramped observations. The smell of herring in the 3rd week of the season versus the 4th. How to tell a fish that had been iced on the boat from one that had been iced at the dock, the particular gray of a place's underbelly when it had been more than 2 days out of the water. He had drawn small diagrams in the margins, practical and ugly, labeled in his careful dockworker's hand. He had been teaching himself to write properly well into his 30s. And it showed. Tabby had read every page so many times she could recite most of them. She closed the notebook and looked at the evening's accounts. The income column was respectable. The outgoings were worse. Her mother's joint liniment apothecary in Kesterly stocked the only preparation that H. helped, and it cost 8 pence a jar, and her mother went through a jar and a half a month since the damp had got properly into her hands. Her sister Clara's school fees at the dame's school on Harbour Street were due again at the end of the week. 1 shilling in 4. The stall rental to old Mr. Penhaligon, who owned the row of pitches along the North Quay, was 3 shillings the month, payable on Fridays. There were other things: coal, candles, the piece of leather she needed for her boot heel, but those she had written small, in pencil, as if making them faint might make them lighter. Her father had died in a storm 3 years ago in November. He had not died at sea, which was what the story sounded like when people told it and which made it slightly more dramatic than the truth. He had died on the beach, in the shallows, trying to pull in the catch from a boat that had been driven against the sandbar. He had gone in up to his thighs in the dark to get a grip on the rope, and the wave that caught him had been neither large nor particularly violent, and he had simply gone down and not come up. And by the time they found him he was still holding a length of net with a 3-pound bass still caught in it. The bass had fed his family for 2 days. Tabby had been 19. Clara had been 7. Their mother's hands had already been going stiff in the cold weather. She had taken over the STA. The following Monday. She did not sign her records with her name. Ladies did not trade in fish, which she was not precisely, but gentlewoman's daughter was a category that floated somewhere between lady and fishwife and satisfied the requirements of neither. And she had found it easier to leave the question unasked. Her father had marked his accounts with a small printed fish, the species changing with the season's catch, and she had kept the practice. Pressing the little stamp head carved from an off-cut of pine into the ink pad and onto the page. Cod in winter. Mackerel in summer. The merchants who dealt with her knew the mark. The ones who didn't know it would not have thought to look. She pulled on her coat. Tucked the notebook inside her oil bag with the knife. And picked up the salting crate. The walk home was 15 minutes along the quay and up the hill to the row of cottages on Petrol Lane. The smell of the sea came with her the whole way. She had seen the Duke of Foscote once before, the Tuesday at the harbour, that had been at the Midsummer Assam. Bligh in the assembly rooms above the King's Arms, which she had attended because Mrs. Polgarth from the lending library had a spare ticket and would not hear of Tabby declining it. And which had cost Tabby the use of a pair of gloves borrowed from her neighbour and an evening she would have preferred to spend re-waterproofing her boot soles. She had stood near the wall where the women without partners stood. The room was watching the door. She had heard the name Foscote from 3 separate conversations before she understood what the watching was about. The Duke had come home from the Navy in the spring. The previous Duke, his father, had died 18 months ago, and the title had sat waiting while the son was somewhere in the Atlantic on His Majesty's business. And now he was home, and the county was curious that he came in late, as she gathered the newly arrived always did, and he was exactly what she would have guessed from the watching: tall, dark. With the particular self-containment of a man who had spent years in company he had not chosen and learned to take up very little room in it. He was not handsome in any warm way. His face was the kind that looked well in bad weather and merely correct in good. He acknowledged the master of ceremony. Declined to dance, and positioned himself near the window with a glass he did not drink. The matrons brought their daughters to him, one by one, with the patient industry of people performing a necessary civic function. He answered each of them in 2 words. He let them go, she had thought. There is a man who would rather be anywhere on this earth than here, and had nearly felt sorry for him, and had not quite, because he was here voluntarily and she was here because Mrs. Polgarth had pressed. She did not speak to him that evening. She had not been brought forward. And she had not brought herself forward. And when the assembly ended she had walked the 2 miles home in the dark with her borrowed gloves folded carefully in her pocket and thought nothing about him at all. The Tuesday at the harbour was different. She had heard the harbour-master's voice first, the particular carrying bellow he used for official visitors, and then the sound of boots on the dock that were not fishermen's boots, too clean, too regular, and she had registered it the way she registered weather, information for potential future use, not yet relevant. She was dressing a cod. The cod was 3 pounds, fresh. With clear eyes and bright red gills. She had bought it off the Pendragon at 6 that morning when the boats came in and had been keeping it iced all day. Waiting for a buyer who would pay properly for the quality. The buyer had not materialized. By 4 in the afternoon she had decided to dress it and sell it at the market rate rather than let the quality start to fade. She was on her knees on the stone. The knife was in her hand. The boots stop. 3 yards away. This is what you call a fish market. The voice was low and flat and not quite a question. She had heard it before once, at the assembly, and placed it without looking up. Your Grace. That was the harbour-master. The main trade is done by midday. As I mentioned, the freshest stock. It smells like the inside of a net. A pause. Does it always, in the warm season, Your Grace? Somewhat more. The boots moved. They stopped closer. She felt him looking at her. Not at her face. At her hands. What is that woman doing? That would be a Salt's daughter, Your Grace. Daniel Salt was a fishmonger on this quay for near on 20 years. She carries on her knees. Not a question either, it's the common practice for the God help the man who weds a fishwife. The voice was not raised. It carried the way cold carries. Without effort, reaching everywhere. Hell find his bed sheet smell of the sea forever. The harbour-master made a sound that was most of a laugh. The other men, 2 customs officers. A dockhand boy who had paused his sweeping completed it. Tabby's knife went in just below the jaw. Straight. Steady. Bone is bone, her father's voice said. In the part of her memory where he still lived. Gut is gut. Never let the blade wander. She dressed the fish. She laid it on the ice. She reached for the cloth at her apron strings and wiped the blade, 3 passes, spine to tip. Without haste, the boots moved away, the harbormaster's voice resumed its official register, something about the new breakwater proposal, the cost of stone. The dockhand boy was watching her. He was perhaps 12, with a wide uncertain face. And he looked like he wanted to say something helpful and hadn't yet worked out what it would be. She picked up the dressed cod and set it in the display. She did not cry. She had learned the value of that a long time ago, learned it the week after her father died. When the fish merchant on the South Quay had told her a girl couldn't manage the pitch alone, and she had stood in his doorway and worked out that the only thing tears would buy her was his certainty that he was right. She had not cried then either. She had gone back to the stall and opened at 6th. Next morning and every morning after. That evening she walked home along the quay with her oil bag on her shoulder and the dressed cod wrapped for sale tomorrow and the knife in its cloth and her father's notebook under her arm. The wind off the sea was sharp and the lanterns along the harbor wall made orange shapes on the black water. She thought about the boots, she thought about the voice, she thought, not for the first time. That contempt was a peculiar thing in a man who did not look like he was enjoying it. Then she thought about her mother's liniment and Clara's school fees and the stall rental due Friday. And by the time she reached Petrol Lane she had stopped thinking about the boots altogether. The letter arrived 3 days later. The letter came on a Thursday, brought by a man in dark livery on a horse that was too good for the Kesterly roads that he asked for Salt's daughter at the harbor gate. And someone pointed him up Petrol Lane. And Tabby answered the door with her father's notebook still in her hand because she had been cross-referencing last Tuesday's catch weights against the previous years and did not like to lose her place. The man looked at the notebook. He looked at her apron. He handed her the letter with the express ion of someone completing a task that had turned out stranger than briefed. The seal was dark blue wax, pressed with a cormorant spreading its wings. She knew that seal. Everyone on the Kesterly coast knew it. Foscote, Miss Salt. I am told you know fish. I am told you know them better than any man currently employed on this coastline, and that you charge an honest price for the knowledge. Which is rarer than the knowledge itself. My late husband kept a collection of preserved and smoked sea goods in the boathouse at Foscote Park, 7 crates. Acquired over 30 years of trade interest in the eastern routes. They have been locked in that boathouse for 11 years and I want to know what can be saved before the damp and the beetles finish the rest. Come to Foscote Park on the 15th. Bring your tools. Name your terms to my woman of business and do not be modest about them. Drusilla, Dowager Duchess of Foscote. Tabby read the letter twice. She stood in the doorway of the cottage on Petrol Lane with the cormorant seal broken in her hand and the Kesterly harbor visible at the bottom of the hill, grey and familiar. And she thought about the boots on the dock and the voice that had carried without effort to every man within 20 feet. Then she looked back at the letter. Name your terms and do not be modest about them. She thought about her mother's hands. She thought about Clara's school fees. She thought about the stall rental due Friday. Tell her Grace, she said to the man in the livery, that'll be there. She spent the 2 days before the 15th in preparation. Clara was sent to Mrs. Polgarth, who had already promised to hear her reading and feed her adequately and would do both with enthusiasm. Her mother was settled with enough liniment for a fortnight and strict instructions about the coal supply. Tabby's tools were unwrapped, checked, and rewrapped, the gutting knife, the 2 sorting blades, the small brass scale her father had used for assessing dried weights, the ink pad and the fish stamp for marking records. And the notebook with 30 blank pages she had been saving for a job that warranted them. She pressed her better dress and cleaned her boots and told herself, 3 times on the morning of the 15th, that she was going to Foscote Park to do a job of work, not to be seen. And that the man who had spoken on the dock would almost certainly not notice her at all, which was exactly the arrangement she preferred. The carrier's cart took her out along the coast road in a cold bright morning. 8 miles of bare winter hedges and the sea appearing and disappearing on the left. The driver said nothing. It suited her. Foscote Park sat at the end of a lime avenue that had not been attended to in some years. The house was large and grey and mostly closed. Tabby counted the shuttered windows. As the cart came up the drive and stopped, counting at 20. A single line of smoke rose from one chimney out of what appeared to be 14. The formal garden at the front had been put to bed for winter, but not, she thought, with much conviction. As though someone had begun the job and then stopped caring partway through, the butler let her in, an old man, very upright, who looked at her oil bag the way people look at things from foreign countries, and took her to a room where a fire actually burned. The Dowager Duchess was small and straight-backed and somewhere north of 80, with a face that had been sharp once and was now magnificent. All angles and intelligence, and eyes that went over Tabby from bonnet to boot sole in a single pass and missed nothing. "You're younger than I hoped," said the Dowager. "And thinner. Sit down. Bultantia, and something with it. She's come 8 miles in an open cart and she's too sensible to complain about it." Tabby sat. "I'm quite warm, your grace. You're cold and you're hungry, and there's no virtue in pretending otherwise." The Dowager studied her. "You have your father's look about you. I saw Daniel Salt work once. At the midsummer market, years ago. He could tell a fish's age by the smell. Can you do that, most species?" "Yes." "Good." The cane tapped once on the floor. "Then you're what I need. The boathouse has been locked since my husband died. My grandson locked it again when he came home and has not opened it since. I want to know what's in those crates before it's all dust and beetles. I want it sorted, recorded. And whatever can be preserved. Preserved." A pause. "My grandson will not interfere with you. He will pretend you are not here. You will find that considerably easier than the alternative." Tabby thought of the dock. Of the voice. Of the boots that had stopped and then moved away. "Does the Duke know I'm here, your grace?" The Dowager's eyes did something that was not quite a smile. "He knows someone is coming to see to the boathouse. The details," she said, "I have kept flexible." They gave her a small room in the east wing, which still had fires, and a place at the servants' table. And the key to the boathouse. She went alone that first evening with a lantern. The boathouse was set into the cliffside behind the main house, accessible through a gate in the kitchen garden wall and down a long stone path. It was built from the same grey stone as the house, with a wide sea door on the harbour side that had been bolted from within and a smaller land door that took her key. The smell came out before Shed got the door open. 2 inches, not rot, quite, or not only rot. It was deeper than rot, and stranger. Salt and wood smoke and something resinous she couldn't immediately name. And underneath all of it the particular sweet dark smell of organic matter that had been sealed in the dark for too long. She knew the smell of things kept past their time. She stood in the doorway with her lantern raised and looked at it. Had been a beautiful space once. Long stone shelves ran along 3 walls, and on them sat 7 large wooden crates, each stenciled with Portoforican markings she could make out even from the door. Fujian, Nagasaki, Penang, Lisbon. A ship's lantern hung from the central beam. Long cold. In the corner nearest the sea door stood a wooden chair with a coat still draped over its back, stiff with years of cold, and beside it a small table with a cup on it. And in the cup a long dried residue that had been tea. Someone had been sitting here. Someone had left in the middle of a cup of tea and not come back. Tabby set her lantern on the nearest shelf and took out her notebook. She was deep in the 3rd crate. Dried abalone from what she was now fairly certain was a Fujianese smoking house, remarkable quality, the preservation far better than Shed expected. When she heard the land door, she did not hear footsteps. She heard the door, and then silence. And then she looked up. He was standing just inside the threshold. He was not carrying a light. He was standing in the darkness beyond the reach of her lantern, and she did not know how long he had been there, and his face in the half-shadow was the same face she remembered from the dock. Closed. Controlled. The face of a man who had learned to keep everything behind it. He was looking at the chair in the corner. The coat on the back of it. At the cup, Tabby got to her feet. Her hands were grey with the dust of the crates. She curtsied. "Your Grace." That he did not answer immediately. His eyes moved. Round the chair to the open crate to the neat line she had started along the dry end of the central shelf. Each item she had processed laid carefully on a square of clean cloth with its record tag beside it. Something moved across his face. And was gone before she could read it. "That is my father's boathouse," he said. His voice was flat. Not cold, exactly. Flat in the way of a man who has learned that flat is safer than the alternative. "Yes. Your Grace. I know." She waited. "Your grandmother commissioned the work. I can stop if—" "Don't stop." He said it quickly, and then seemed to hear himself, and steadied. "Don't stop. What you've put on the shelf, those are worth saving, the abalone." "Yes. Remarkably well preserved. The curing on the Fujian stock especially." She paused. Someone knew what they were buying. Another silence. "He was looking at the coat on the chair again." "That he did," the Duke said. "He knew exactly what he was buying." That he looked at her, then really looked. Not the dock assessment of hands and apron, but something more direct and less comfortable. And then he looked at the knife tucked into her work belt. "What is the handle?" he said. "Whalejaw. It was my father's." A pause. "He worked the harbor point 20 years, the Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father kept a record book. Somewhere in those crates, probably. If you find it." He stopped. "I'll set it aside," Tabby said. "Separate from the inventory. You'll have it as soon as I find it." That he nodded once. He looked at the coat on the chair for the last time, then he turned and went out, and the door closed behind him. And Tabby stood in the lanternlight with the smell of Fujian wood smoke around her and looked at the empty chair in the corner for a long moment before she went back to the crates. She picked up her pencil. She wrote, "Item 7, abalone, Fujian origin, cold smoked. Excellent preservation. Handle with care." Then she wrote, "No chair in northeast corner. Coat on back. Do not move." Lady Cairn arrived on a Wednesday in a carriage that was too good for the Foscote lanes and knew it. Tabby heard the wheels from the boathouse, the particular sound of well-sprung suspension over uneven stone, and noted it, and went back to the Nagasak I crate, which had proved to contain 6 varieties of dried kelp in varying states of survival and required her full attention. She did not meet Lady Cairn until the following afternoon. She was coming up from the boathouse through the kitchen garden when she heard the voice ahead of her on the path, clear, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had learned to project without appearing to raise it. And then the woman herself came around the corner of the espaliered wall, alone, moving with the particular deliberateness of someone who had come this way on purpose. She was perhaps 35, dark-haired, dressed in the expensive half-mourning of a widow who had finished grieving and wished to make that clear. She wore a single strand of pearls, and she was lovely in the way of things that have been kept very carefully and have never been used hard. She looked at Tabby. She looked at Tabby's hands, which were grey with kelp dust. She looked at the oil bag on Tabby's shoulder and the notebook tucked under her arm. "You must be the fish person," she said. "Tabitha Salt, my lady." Tabby curtsied. "In cataloguing the boathouse collection for her Grace, yes." Lady Cairn drew off one glove, finger by finger. "I.D. Hurd. A fishmonger's daughter." She said it with the tone of someone confirming an unlikely piece of information. "He's let you into the house." "Her Grace engaged me, my lady." "Her Grace." A small smile. "Of course she did." She walked past Tabby along the path, then stopped and turned. "You're from Kesterly?" "The harbor market, yes, my lady." "That I thought so." She looked at her pleasantly. "I know Kesterly quite well. Mrs. Enwolf, wife of the new harbormaster, she's a great talker. Lovely woman." The smile stayed where it was. "I imagine we'll see each other again. Miss Salt. This is a small house." She went around the corner of the wall and was gone. Tabby stood on the kitchen garden path with the kelp dust settling on her fingers. She opened her notebook to the day's page. In the bottom corner, where she usually stamped her fish mark, she pressed the ink pad instead and drew, freehand, a single small fish. She made it larger than usual. Then she went inside to wash her hands. She saw Lady Cairn once more that same evening. That it was on the back staircase, the narrow one the servants used. which Tabby had taken to using herself because it was faster between the east wing and the kitchen. Lady Cairn was coming down as Tabby was going up. And the staircase was not wide enough for two people to pass without acknowledgement. Lady Cairn stopped on the step above and looked down at her. "Miss Salt." She said it the way people say a name when they have been thinking about it. "I've been asking about you. You've been coming to this harbor Ark at Kesterly for 3 years now, since your father died." "Yes, my lady, and before that you helped him. Since you were a girl." She tilted her head slightly. "You know everyone on that quay. The fishermen, the merchants, the harbor master's wife." A pause. Precisely waited. "Old Kernoth, retired netmender, lives in the end cottage on Strand Row. You bring him fish on Thursday evenings. Alone. After dark, sometimes." Tabby kept her face level. "He can't get to the market himself." "My lady." "His hip. Of course." Lady Cairn smiled. "Of course that's all it is. I'm sure anyone who heard about it would understand completely." She moved past Tabby down the stairs, one hand trailing the wall. At the bottom she paused without turning. "I do hope the work in the boathouse goes well, Miss Salt. It would be a shame to leave it unfinished." Her footsteps moved away down the corridor. Tabby stood on the staircase in the dark and did not move for the count of 20. Then she went up to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at her hands for a while. She picked up her father's notebook. She did not open it. She held it the way another woman might hold a cross, then she put it down, lit her candle, and went back to work. The axle broke 4 miles out of Kesterly on the coast road, in the dark. In the rain that it had been the dowager's doing. Though not intentionally, the old woman had looked at Tabby's list of requirements for the second phase of the preservation work and announced that the nearest supplier who stocked the correct grade of preservation salt and the particular type of seed-aligned box she needed was Pokerose in Kesterly. And that Miss Salt would go to Kesterly on Thursday to procure them, and that since the Duke had business at the land agent's office in any case, he would take her in the closed carriage. And that was the end of the matter. The Duke had said nothing at breakfast when the Dowager told him. Tabby had said nothing either. They had sat in the carriage for the first mile in a silence that was not comfortable and not quite hostile, which was its own particular kind of difficult. The road ran along the cliff top and the sea was visible below, grey and restless, with whitecaps in the middle distance. The Duke sat on the opposite side and looked out the window on the inland side, which meant he was looking at a hedge. Tabby looked at her list. "The cedar boxes," the Duke said, without preamble, "are for the kelp samples." She looked up. "For the Nagasaki stock?" "Yes. The moisture content is still too high for permanent storage. Cedar slows the reabsorption, and the preservation salt. The abalone. I've been using a dry pack method, but the grade available from the Foscote kitchen stores is too coarse. It draws moisture unevenly." She paused. "I can show you the differential when we get back, if that would be useful." He looked at her, then not at the hedge. "It would," he said. After that it was easier. He asked her how she had learned to read the provenance markings on the crates, the Chinese port stamps, the Nagasaki agent Sealand. She told him about her father's system. How he had acquired a Cantonese phrase book from a retired East India merchant and spent 3 winters teaching himself to recognize the character groups that corresponded to grade and origin. How she had learned it the same way she had learned everything from him. Sitting beside him in the evenings with the book open between them, his finger moving under the characters, her finger following. He listened the way very few people listened, without preparing his next remark. He sounds like a methodical man. The Duke said he was. He was also, she considered. He thought everything was worth understanding properly. A fish, a character from a foreign alphabet, the best way to sharpen a blade. He didn't see why any of it should be beneath attention. A silence that was different from the earlier one. No. The Duke said. Neither do I. In Kesterly, the agent at Pokerose was a thin young man with the manner of someone who had recently been promoted and was uncertain it had been warranted. He looked at Tabby's list and then at Tabby and decided, visibly, that she was less than the list implied. He was slow to fetch the cedar boxes. He was slower still to produce the preservation salt, and when he did he brought the wrong grade. And when she explained this to him he looked at the boxes on the shelf behind him with the expression of a man consulting an internal authority that was not present. Perhaps, he said, with a small precise hesitation. The lady would prefer to leave the selection to. She wouldn't. The Duke's voice came from directly behind her left shoulder. She had not heard him move. Miss Salt is restoring the boathouse collection at Foscote Park at my grandmother's commission and my own. You will show her whatever she asks to see. And you will charge her the fair price, because she will know to a farthing if you haven't. A pause that had weight in it. Is that clear? It was clear. The agent brought the correct salt. He brought it quickly, and he wrapped everything with considerable care. And he did not look at Tabby's list again as though it had made a mistake. Outside on the Kesterly Street, with the parcels under her arm and the rain starting in earnest, Tabby found that she could not look at the Duke directly. You didn't need to do that. She said that he was wasting your time. Men waste my time every day, Your Grace. It isn't worth a Duke's intervention that he stopped walking. She stopped too, because he had, and looked up at him, and found he was looking down at her with an expression she didn't have a ready word for. It's worth mine. He said. Simply. As though it were an obvious thing, she had nothing to say to that. So she said nothing, and they went to find a cart for the cedar boxes. The axle went on the return journey, for miles out. With a sound like a gunshot and a lurch that sent Tabby into the door and the parcels across the floor, the coachman assessed the damage with a lantern and a practiced grimness and delivered his verdict. The wheel was finished, the nearest wheelwright was in Kesterly. And nothing would be moving until morning. There was an inn half a mile back along the road. Tabby had noticed it on the way out, a small building with a good chimney and a sign that said The Anchor, which she had thought was appropriate for this part of the coast. They walked to it in the rain. The Duke carrying the larger of the cedar boxes without being asked, and the coachman going ahead on the horse to arrange a wheelwright for first light. The landlady was a comfortable woman who took in their situation with a single look and began producing solutions. A private parlor. 2 rooms above, a fire already laid, and supper within the hour. They were the only guests. The parlor was low-ceilinged and warm, with a fire that had been burning long enough to have formed opinions, and a table set for 2. And the sound of the rain on the single small window making everything beyond it feel very far away. The landlady brought them cold beef and pickled cabbage and a plate of bread that was the kind of bread that knows what it's doing, and a pot of tea, and left them to it. Tabby ate. She was hungry. And the bread was good, and there was no use pretending otherwise. The Duke ate too, which surprised her slightly. She had expected the food to be beneath his attention, and it wasn't. They were on the second cup of tea when he said, without looking up from the fire. I was 7 years old. She waited. Why father took me out on the harbor pilot's boat. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because I had a Latin lesson I was meant to be at, and he came to the schoolroom door and said, come on. And I came. He was quiet for a moment. He was showing me how the mainsail was rigged. There was a line he wanted me to hold, and I had it. And then the wind changed and the boom came round and I let go of the line to get out of the way of it. His hands were around his cup. Not gripping. Just resting there. He wasn't holding on to anything. He went over the side, the fire settled, the harborman Hicks got to him. He wasn't in the water more than 2 minutes. He came home and had supper and was absolutely fine. A long pause. He died 8 months later of a fever that had nothing to do with any of it. But the last time I was on a boat, the last thing I did, he stopped. You let go of the line. Tabby said that I let go of the line. The rain ran down the window glass. Somewhere outside, a shutter was loose and tapping. Why father died on the beach. Tabby said. In the shallows. I've worked the harbor every day since. She looked at the fire. I don't think I'm braver than you. I think I didn't have the option of stopping that. He looked at her. That is, she said, carefully, one way of managing it. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Exactly. Something that had been rigid for a long time making a small, tentative movement, and the other way. He said, spend 20 years not going near the sea. She paused. It also works. Mostly that he looked at his cup. Then he made a sound low, brief. From somewhere that had not been used in some time, and it took her a moment to understand that it was a laugh that it was not polished. It was the laugh of a man who had been surprised by something his own lungs did. And was not entirely certain how to respond to it. Tabby looked at the fire so he would not have to manage being seen. They sat on opposite sides of the parlor until the fire had burned low, and the rain had settled into the steady rhythm that meant it would last till morning. And when she finally went up to her narrow room and lay in the dark listening to it on the roof, she understood something she had been carefully not understanding for several weeks. She lay still and let herself understand it. Because there was no particular use in not, she was in a great deal of trouble. After that, the evenings changed that he began to come to the boathouse, not every evening. Not announced. But 3 or 4 times a week she would hear the land door at some point in the later part of the afternoon. And she would not look up, and after a moment he would move to the far end of the workbench and either sit or stand, depending on what was available that he did not come to inspect. She understood that without being told. The first evening he carried, without asking, a crate she had been putting off because it was too heavy to manage alone from the high shelf. He simply took it down. She said thank you. He said nothing, which was by then a language she was learning. That he began to help with the sorting. Slowly at first she had to show him the system, which was precise about categories and not forgiving of approximation, but he learned quickly and without complaint. And his hands, which were a soldier's hands, broad and blunt and built for ropes and reins, became careful over the dried goods with a patience she had not predicted. One evening she was working through the Penang crate, a collection of dried spice fish, each variety wrapped in a different grade of waxed paper, and she held one out to him and said, "Tell me what you smell." That he took it. He turned it over. He held it near the lantern. "Wood," he said. And he brought it closer to his face, which was the right instinct. Something sharp. Green. Almost. That's the lemongrass in the cure. Penang method. It's what distinguishes it from the Fujian cold smoke. She took it back. "You're better at this than I expected." "You expected badly." "I expected someone who'd been told fish smell unpleasant for long enough that had stopped being able to smell past that." A silence. "That I may have been told that," he said. "That I know." She did not look at him when she said it. She put the spice fish on its record cloth and picked up her pencil and wrote, "Penang, lemongrass cured, excellent condition, distinctive aromatic profile intact after estimated 12 years storage." She was aware, without looking, that he was watching her write. "What does the mark mean?" He said. "The fish on the record tag. It's my father's system. He used it to mark his accounts. I kept it. You don't use your name. Ladies don't trade in fish." She kept writing. "I find it simpler not to raise the question." Another silence. "Longer. Why grandmother knows your name." He said. "Your grandmother," Tabby said, "is not the question I'm worried about raising." She finished the entry, set down her pencil, and looked at the next item in the crate. That he did not say anything else. But he stayed until the lantern needed refilling. And when she refilled it he held it steady for her without being asked, and the boathouse smelled of Penang lemongrass and old cedar and the sea coming in under the door, and neither of them mentioned any of it. Walking back up to the house later, she paused at the gate in the kitchen garden wall. The record tag for the spice fish was still in her hand. She had carried it out by accident. She looked at the small fish stamp in the corner. Then she turned the tag over and, with her pencil, wrote, very small, in the bottom margin, "Tea, salt." Just that. She tucked it into her notebook and went inside. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into the work. When he picked up her father's knife, she had left it on the corner of the workbench while she dealt with the last of the Lisbon crate, a collection of salt cod that had survived better than anything else in the boathouse. Packed in the old Portuguese method with alternating layers of coarse salt and bay leaf, the fish still firm and pale and smelling of the Atlantic in the way that good salt cod always does. Which is to say clean and sharp and like the sea on a cold morning rather than the sea on a warm afternoon. She was making her final entries for the evening, and the knife was where she always left it when she wasn't using it, blade folded back toward the handle on its single pivot. The whale jaw grip worn smooth on the upper side where a thumb had rested for 20 years that he picked it up without asking. She looked up that he was turning it over in his hands, not opening it. Just feeling the weight and the balance. His expression was the careful one he wore when he was attending to something properly. My father had one like this, he said. Not the same, his was a sailor's knife. Longer blade. But the handle material. He ran his thumb along the jawbone curve. He said whale jaw was warmer than wood. Holds the temperature of the hand that it does. She watched him. My father bought it from a bone carver in Kesterly for $1. He used it every day for 20 years that he said it own. He set it down carefully, oriented the same way he had found it that I said a thing to you, he said. On the dock, the boathouse was very quiet. The sea moved under the harbor door, a regular soft sound, not intrusive. Tabby put down her pencil. You did. She said that he did not look at her. He looked at the knife. God help the man who weds a fishwife. Hell find his bed sheets smell of the sea forever. He said it the way a man recites a charge against himself, flat, precise. Not softened. I said it in front of the harbor master and 2 customs officers and a boy with a broom, and everyone in earshot laughed, and I let them. He was quiet for a moment. I was standing on that dock and the wind was off the water and the smell of it. He stopped. Started again. More slowly. I was afraid. I have been afraid of that smell since I was 7 years old, and I have spent 20 years turning the fear into contempt because contempt is easier to wear in company. And on that dock I put on the contempt and I pointed it at you. And that was. He picked up the knife again. Put it down again. That was the most dishonest thing I have done since I came home. And I have done a considerable number of dishonest things since I came home. The fire in the small iron stove had burned to the stage where it gave heat without noise. Oh. Outside, a gull called once, far off. Tabby looked at her hands on the workbench. The pencil beside them. The record tag for the salt cod, half filled. That I heard you, she said. On the dock. She kept her voice level. I finished dressing the fish and I went home and I wrote the day's accounts. And I told myself I had been called worse by better men and it wasn't worth the space in my head. A pause. That was also dishonest. I stopped for 3 seconds before I finished the cut. I have not stopped mid-cut since I was 12 years old. That he looked at her then. 0.3 seconds. He said 0.3 seconds. That he understood what that meant. She could see that he understood. That I am not asking you to forgive it, he said. I am telling you that I know what I did, specifically. Not I was rude or I spoke out of turn. I took fear that belonged to me, and I made it into a weapon. And I used it on someone who had done nothing except exist near the thing I was afraid of. That is what I did. He looked at the knife. You were taught properly. Your father taught you properly. What I said had nothing to do with you. Tabby was quiet for a moment. That I know that. She said. I knew it on the dock. She picked up the pencil. I knew something was wrong with the way you said it. It didn't sound like a man who was disgusted. It sounded like a man who was. She considered. Flinching, something moved in his face. That I forgave it, she said. Some time ago. The day I saw the chair in the corner with the coat on it. Any man who locks a room rather than walk into it and find someone gone. She put the pencil down again. That is not a cruel man. That is a man who has run out of ways to say that he is in pain. She met his eyes. I have handled enough things that have been closed up too long to mistake the difference. The fire gave a small sound. Settled. That he did not say anything for a while, then he reached out and picked up her father's knife one last time. He held it for a moment. Just held it. The whale jaw warm from the lamplight and set it down again at the edge of the workbench, in the exact position where she always put it. Blade facing in. Handle toward her hand. Your father taught you well, he said. Yes. She said. He did. She picked up the pencil and finished the record tag for the salt cod. He stayed until she had closed the notebook, and then they walked back up to the house through the kitchen garden in the dark without speaking. And it was not the silence of people who have nothing to say. Lady Cairn found her in the long gallery on a Thursday morning. Tabby had been on her way to the library to consult a reference volume the Dowager had mentioned, a merchant's trade guide from the previous century that might have informati. On the Nagasaki agent's stamp she hadn't been able to identify, and she had taken the long gallery as the most direct route. Which she now understood had been a miscalculation. Lady Cairn was waiting. There was no other word for the particular quality of stillness she had arranged herself into at the far end of the gallery, beside the shuttered window. In the grey morning light that came through the gaps in the shutters and lay in thin bars across the holland-covered paintings on the walls, she was not smiling this time. Tabby stopped when she saw her. She did not retreat, Miss Salt. Lady Cairn came forward 3 steps. I thought we might speak. Plainly. If you like, my lady, you've been here 4 weeks. She looked at Tabby with an expression that had stopped performing pleasantness. I have known this family for 15 years. I knew the previous Duke. I have had an understanding with this one, on and off. For longer than I choose to specify. The pearls at her throat caught the thin light. I intend to be the next Duchess of Foscote. I should have been already, if things had gone differently. I want you to understand that I am not speaking from vanity. Tabby said nothing. That he looks at you. Lady Cairn said, the way he used to look at the sea. Before. She said it precisely, clinically. As a woman stating an unwelcome fact she has already accounted for. I have no interest in debating what that means. I am here to discuss what happens next. She reached into the small bag at her wrist and produced a folded paper. She did not open it. I have spoken with Mrs. Anwill. She has spoken to others. Kesterly is a small place and it has a long memory. Tabby kept her eyes on Lady Cairn's face. Old Colonel, Lady Cairn said. Thursday evenings. After dark. Twice that Mrs. Anwill's sister saw you herself, and once that the harbour master's boys saw you coming away. She unfolded the paper slightly. Not enough to read, just enough to indicate that it existed and contained things. A woman of respectable family, alone, at a man's lodgings after dark. The fact that he is 73 and can't manage his own stairs is not the version that travels well. He can't manage his stairs. Tabby said. Someone has to bring him his fish. Yes. Lady Cairn smiled, and it was the least warm expression Tabby had ever seen arranged into that shape. That is the true version. You and I both know it. The version that travels is considerably shorter. And considerably less to your credit. She refolded the paper. And then there is the matter of the fees. You take wages for the work of your hands. You have been taking wages for 3 years, from merchants and circulating libraries and private households. And you mark your accounts with a fish stamp instead of your name because you know what is said about a gentlewoman who trades. She put the paper away. 1 word from me in the right rooms and you are finished in this county. Your mother's liniment and your sister's school fees. She paused. Letting the list complete itself in the air between them will require a different solution. The gallery was cold. The covered paintings stood along the walls like shapes under snow, and the Duke, Lady Cairn continued. Will find that whatever attachment he has formed to a fishmonger's daughter has made him the entertainment of 3 counties. A proud man survives that exactly once. She looked at Tabby steadily. He has already spent that once. I am told the previous Duke's death occasioned some irregularity in the inheritance. People were watching him before you arrived. Tabby stood very still. Go home, Miss Salt. Finish the inventory, take your wages, go back to Kesterly. If you do that, I have no reason to speak to anyone about anything. If you stay. She lifted one shoulder. I am not responsible for what I know. She walked past Tabby down the gallery without looking back. Her heels were precise on the bare boards. Regular as a clock, Tabby stood among the covered paintings and did not move until the sound had gone. Then she walked to the window at the near end of the gallery and stood looking out through the gap in the shutters at the kitchen garden below, the bare winter beds. The path down to the boathouse gate. Her hands were at her sides. They were steady. She made them stay that way. She stood there for the count of perhaps 50. Then she went to find the library, and the merchant's trade guide, and she spent the next 2 hours identifying the Nagasaki stamp, which turned out to belong to a trading house that had been operating out of the same address since 1761 and was, she discovered, still in business. She wrote the entry up very neatly. She drew the fish stamp in the corner. Below it, in small careful letters, she wrote Tea, salt. She had been writing it on the record tags for 11 days now. She did not stop. The last crate was the heaviest that it had been there from the beginning, pushed to the back of the lowest shelf against the seawall, half hidden behind the empty cedar boxes from the first week's work. Tabby had noted it on her initial inventory. Crate 7, markings unclear, access difficult, deferred a final stage. Anne had deferred it faithfully through 5 weeks of working from easier to harder, which was her father's system, and a sound one. On the last Thursday of January she ran out of reasons to defer it further. She had moved the cedar boxes the previous evening. The crate itself was oak, older than the others, with iron corner brackets that had rusted to the point of being structural, which was to say they were holding the thing together rather than reinforcing it. The port markings on the side had been painted over at some point, which was unusual, and the lid had been secured not with the standard packing nails but with a Hispan staple and a small padlock, which was unusual enough that she had put it in her notes with 2 asterisks. She was crouching in front of it with a crowbar and no very clear plan when the door opened. She did not look up. "I need the crowbar from the tool chest," she said. "The longer one, that this one." He was already holding it. He had come in quietly, the way he did now. She had stopped registering the sound of the door as a disruption weeks ago, and he looked at the crate and then at her and handed her the crowbar without further comment. She tried the hasp first. The padlock was rusted solid. That approach was finished. She worked the longer crowbar under the lid at the hinge side and applied weight, and he came down beside her without being asked and added his to it. And the lid gave with a sound like something that had been holding its breath. The smell was different from the other crates, not rot, not salt and wood smoke. Something older and drier, cedar, yes, and something resinous she had smelled before in old books and old rooms. And under it a faint ghost of tobacco that was not unpleasant and was not recent. "That's pipe tobacco," the Duke said, very quietly. Tabby looked into the crate. The top layer was wrapped bundles of what turned out to be dried fish, small, flat, extremely well preserved. The wrapping a heavy waxed cotton she hadn't seen in the other crates. She lifted them out carefully, one by one, and set them on the record cloth. 6 bundles. 7. Below them, packed in place with folded sailcloth, was a wooden box approximately the size of a large ledger, cedar, hand-fitted, with a simple brass catch. And below that, nested in the sailcloth like something put to bed, were 3 objects: a pipe with a cracked stem, a compass in a leather case, and a logbook. The logbook was bound in oilskin. It had the name Foscote stamped into the cover in the style of a ship's log, with dates on a paper label underneath, 17981805. The Duke's hands had gone still. Tabby did not touch the logbook. She sat back on her heels and looked at it and then looked at him. His face was the careful one, the closed one, but something under it was moving. "The way water moves under ice when the temperature is changing. That's your father's," she said, not a question. "Yes." The word came out flat and contained, the voice he used when he was working very hard to keep something in place. He kept logs. Every trip out. Every season. "I didn't know." He stopped. "I didn't know where they'd gone." Tabby looked at the logbook. Then she looked at the pipe with the cracked stem and the compass in its leather case, and the sailcloth they'd been nested in, and the padlock on the hasp that had been rusted shut for years. "Would you like me to go?" She said that. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Stay." She stayed. That he picked up the logbook and held it for a moment without opening it, just held it, the oilskin cover smooth and dark, his thumb over the stamped name, and she watched his face and did not look away and did not speak. That he opened it. He turned the pages slowly at first, scanning, pausing on entries, moving on. She could see the handwriting from where she sat, a navigator's hand, she thought, precise and economical. The kind of writing that has learned to be legible on a moving ship in bad light. The entries were short. Weather, position, cargo. Notes on the fishing grounds. A working man's record of a working life that he turned to the end of the log. The final entries, she watched him read, she saw the moment he found it. His hand stopped moving. His thumb rested on the page that he read it once. He read it again. She could tell from the qual. "Ity of the stillness, read it," he said. He held the book out to her without looking up. "Please," she took it. The entry was dated the 14th of September, 1805. The handwriting was the same precise navigator's hand, slightly larger than usual. As though written in better light or with more care. Wind from the SSW. Freshening. Decided to make for harbor before noon, glass dropping, and I don't like the look of the horizon to the west. Took Perry out this morning for the first time on the working boat rather than the pleasure dinghy. He is 7½ and has been asking since spring. He found the Spritzel R. Egging very interesting and asked 14 questions about the main sheet block before we had cleared the harbor mouth, which I think is a record even for him. The squall came up faster than I'd reckon should have gone in earlier. My error. The main halyard block seized at the worst moment and I went forward to clear it, which was my second error. Lost my footing on the wet deck. Hicks had the presence of mind to throw the ring and I was not in the water more than 2 minutes cold. But no harm. Perry was frightened. I could see it in his face when Hicks pulled me back aboard. He had stayed at the tiller the whole time, which is where I had told him to stay. And he had stayed that he blames himself. I could see that too. I tried to tell him on the way in but he would not quite hear it, the way children don't hear things when they have decided on aversion. I will try again at home this evening. When he has had time to settle that he did nothing wrong. The block seized. The deck was wet. These are the conditions of the sea and they are nobody's fault. He was 7 and he stayed where I told him and he did not panic and I am. The next words were written slightly differently. As though the pen had been put down and picked up that I am very proud of him. Tabby set the logbook down on the record cloth between them. The boathouse was very quiet. The sea moved under the door in its regular soft rhythm that he tried to tell you. She said. That evening, the Duke was looking at the logbook. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before, not the careful blankness and not the almost smile, but something that had no armor over it at all that I remember the evening. He said. His voice was not quite steady. I remember sitting at supper and not being able to eat. He talked to me. I heard him talking. I had already decided. He stopped. You were 7. Tabby said that he didn't answer. Perry. She said his name because she needed him to hear it. You were 7 years old. You stayed where he told you. You didn't panic. She looked at him. Those are his words. Not mine. That he put his face down into his hands. She did not move. She did not speak. She sat beside him on the cold floor of the boathouse with the logbook between them and the smell of old cedar and old tobacco in the air, and she let him have the time that it was a long time, when he lifted his head. His face was wet and wrecked and clearer than she had ever seen it. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a plain, unself-conscious gesture, and looked at the logbook, and then at her. 20 years, he said. I have been 20 years. And it was in a crate in this room. He looked around the boathouse, at the shelves she had cleared and catalogued, at the record tags in their neat rows, at the lantern light on the stone walls. It was here the whole time. Yes, she said, and I locked the door. You opened it. She said. In the end, you opened it. He looked at her for a moment. We opened it, he said. She did not answer that. She looked down at the logbook, at the last entry. At the words I am very proud of him in the navigator's careful hand. She picked up her pencil. She picked up a record tag. She wrote, Logbook, Personal, 17981805. Condition, excellent. Contents. Irreplaceable. She set it beside the logbook and did not stamp the fish mark in the corner. This one she signed with her full name. She meant to say nothing to him about Lady Cairn, she had decided this on the floor of the boathouse that same evening. After he had gone in and she had sat alone for a while with the logbook and the pipe and the compass and the smell of old tobacco. She would finish the work. She would finish it properly, because it deserved to be finished properly, and then she would go back to Kesterly. And whatever Lady Cairn had intended to do would have nothing left to aim at. That it was a reasonable plan. It required only that she stop writing her name on the record tags, which she could not quite bring herself to do, and that she stop looking at him when he wasn't watching. Which she had apparently also lost the ability to do, and that she believed the work was the only reason she had stayed this long. Which she had stopped believing somewhere around the evening he had learned to identify Penang lemongrass by smell alone and said nothing about it afterwards except to ask her to pass him the next sample. She was still constructing the plan and its necessary fictions on the following morning when the dowager sent for her. The old woman was in her chair by the fire with her cane across her knees and an expression that Tabby had learned to read as "I know something you haven't told me yet and we are going to discuss it. Sit down. Child, Tabby Saturday Bianca Cairn came to see me yesterday evening." The dowager's hands were folded over the cane. They were very still. Which meant she was angry. Tabby had noticed this early. The dowager in a mild mood tapped the cane constantly. The dowager furious did not move at all. "She told me, as an act of pure friendship and concern, several things about you. She told me you take wages for your work. As though I did not know it, as though I had not set the wages myself. She told me about old Curnow on Strand Row, whom I happen to know personally, mended nets for my husband for 30 years, and she implied a great deal that she knew perfectly well was not true and was saying anyway." A pause. "She also told me that my grandson has formed an attachment that is sure word unsuitable. And that it would be a kindness to all concerned if the situation were resolved quietly." Tabby said nothing. "She is afraid." The dowager said. "I want you to understand that. Frightened women make poor enemies because they fight without a plan. She has a jointure and a title and debts that the jointure does not cover, and she has been managing the arithmetic of that for 3 years. She looked at you and saw something she was promised and never given." The old eyes were sharp and very direct. "That does not make her right. It makes her dangerous in the specific way of people who have very little left to lose." "She threatened my sister," Tabby said. "And my mother." And she stopped. "She said he has already used his once. That he can't afford. My grandson," the dowager said precisely, "has been managed and maneuvered and grieved over and whispered about by this county for 4 years. He has been told what he owes the name and what the name requires and what a man in his position must and must not do until he has walled himself into a single room of his own life and called it Aki. Table. The cane came down once, hard. Nobody has offered him a choice. Not once since he came home." She looked at Tabby steadily. "You are going to go and tell him everything. Tonight. The whole of it, Lady Cairn, Curnow, your wages. Your name on those tags. All of it. And you are going to let him choose. He'll be made a laughingstock. He is already lonely." The dowager's voice was not loud. It was the voice of a woman who has learned that volume is for people who are not being listened to. That is considerably worse than being ogged at, and it lasts longer. She looked at Tabby. "Go and tell him. Give him the truth and give him the choice. That is all I am asking." A pause. "It is also, I should mention, the only thing I have ever asked anyone for in 83 years. So I would take it seriously." Tabby looked at her hands. "He'll be in the boathouse," the dowager said. "He has been going there in the evening since the 3rd week. Did you think I hadn't noticed? He was standing at the sea door when she came in, which had been unbolted from the inside for the first time since she'd arrived. It was open a hand's width, and the cold air off the harbor came through it. And he was looking out at the dark water below the cliff with his hands at his sides. That he turned when he heard her. He saw her face and came across the room." "What's happened?" She sat down on the work stool. She made herself look at him directly. "That I need to tell you something," she said. "All of it." And then you need to decide, and I will not think less of you for whatever you decide. But I need you to promise me first that you won't be kind instead of honest. I have had enough of kindness that was a lie. That he sat down across from her. Tell me. He said. So she told him about Lady Cairn in the gallery and the folded paper. She told him about old Curnow and the Thursday evenings and what Mrs. Anwell's sister had seen and what it would sound like in the telling. She told him about the wages and the fish stamp and the 3 years of account signed with a mark instead of a name, and why, and what it would be called if Lady Cairn chose to call it something. She told him what Lady Cairn had said about his name, his county, the once a proud man survives. She told him everything, and she did not soften any of it. And she did not ask for anything. So, she finished. Now you know. You have a name to protect and a house and your grandmother, and those are not small things. If you decide that I should finish the inventory and go back to Kesterly, I will think no less of you. She looked at him steadily. I mean that. These are real costs. I would not have you bear them on my account without knowing what they are. She reached into her apron pocket and took out her father's knife and laid it on the workbench between them. She did not explain he gesture. It was not the kind of gesture that explained well. The boathouse was very quiet. Perry looked at the knife. He looked at her. He looked at the knife for a long time, then he laughed. It was not the laugh she had been braced for, not the cold short sound from the dock. Not the polished social variety she had heard him produce once or twice for the dowager's guests. It was lower than either of those, and rougher, and it came from somewhere that had not been used in a while, and it was the last thing she had expected. And it undid her considerably more than any of the other things he might have done. What? She said. That I am sorry. He was not sorry. He was still laughing, quietly, looking at the knife. I'm sorry. It's only. He stopped. Collected himself. Looked at her with his hawk-colored eyes, which were bright and direct and not cold at all. You laid your father's gutting knife on the workbench between us as though you were putting your sword on the ground. As though you were surrendering a fortification. That I was. She said. Essentially. That I know. He stopped laughing. His face settled into something more serious, but not less warm. The warmth stayed, which was new, which she was still learning to look at without looking away. I know what that was. I know what it cost. He looked at the knife. And then at her. Tabby. He had not called her that before. Her name, yes, Miss Salt, the formal version, but not that. She did not move. Lady Cairn came to see me this morning, he said. Before you. She told me her version of everything you just told me. Which was the same facts arranged to reach a different conclusion. He paused. Her conclusion was that you had been maneuvering deliberately. That the whole of the past 6 weeks had been. He stopped. It doesn't matter what she said. I want to tell you what I thought while she was saying it. Tabby waited. I thought about the first evening, he said. When I came into the boathouse and you didn't hear me come in. And you were on your knees in front of that crate talking to the fish. He said it simply. Without embarrassment. Not to me. Not performing anything for anyone. Talking to a dried fish from Fujian province because it had been packed with considerable skill by someone who knew their work, and you were. He paused. You were glad about it. On behalf of the fish. On behalf of whoever had packed it, decades ago, who would never know anyone had noticed. She did not say anything, and I thought about the chair, he said. The coat on the back of it. You wrote in your notes. I looked at your notes once, early on. I should tell you that. Do not move. Not because I asked you to. Before I'd said a word to you about any of it. The sea door was still open its hands width. The cold air came through steadily, salt and dark. And Tabby had long since stopped noticing the smell of it the way you stopped noticing the sound of a clock in a room. You know well that I thought about you on the staircase, he said. After Cairn spoke to you in the gallery. I know about that too. Bilton saw you standing there afterward. He said you stood still for about a minute and then you went to the library and worked for 2 hours. He looked at her steadily. You went to the library and worked. That it wanted doing. She said, yes. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, and looked at the knife between them. That is exactly it. That is the whole of it. Right there. He was quiet for a moment. I have been in this house for 4 years and I have been told by every person in it what I owe the name and what I must be and what a man in my position cannot be seen to do. I have been managed and arranged and have been sat in this house like an object. The tea needs to be positioned correctly. He glanced up. And then you arrived with a bag of tools and you looked at the boathouse the same way you looked at everything else, the same way you look at a fish at the market. Or a crate that's been packed by someone who knew their business like it was worth understanding properly, and that was all, and you didn't want anything from me except that I not move the chair. Tabby looked at her hands. The county will talk. She said. You know that, the county has been talking about me since my father died. I have yet to find it fatal. He picked up the knife. Not the way he had picked it up before, not to examine it, not to turn it over and assess it. He simply picked it up and held it. The whale jaw handle warm in his palm, the same way she held it when she was tired. My father kept a log, he said. 20 years I have been carrying something that was never mine to carry. And it was in a locked crate in a locked room because I could not open the door. He looked at the knife. You opened the door. You opened every door in this place that I had locked, one at a time, and you didn't ask permission and you didn't make a ceremony of it. He stopped. You just opened them, that's the work, she said. That's all that was. No. He said it quietly and certainly. It wasn't that he turned the knife over once and held it out to her, handle first. She took it that he kept his hand over hers for a moment, not gripping, just resting there. His palm over the back of her hand and the whale jaw handle between them, warm from both their hands now. God help the man who weds a fishwife, he said. Hell find his bed sheet smell of the sea forever. She went very still. That I said that, he continued. In the same even voice. In front of 4 witnesses and a boy with a broom. I said it because I was standing on a dock that smelled of the sea and I was afraid, and I have spent 20 years making contempt out of fear because it travels better in company. He looked at her directly. And I said it abo. The only person on that dock who was doing something real. Who was doing it well. Who was doing it with her father's knife and her father's knowledge and her father's way of paying attention to things that are worth paying attention to. A pause. I said it, and it was the most dishonest thing I have said since I came home, because what I meant what I would have said if I had been a braver man on a dock that smelled of brine at 4 in the afternoon. He turned her hand over in his. What I meant was, God help the man who weds her, because he will have to deserve it every day. And I am not certain I am capable of that. And I want the chance to try. The fire in the stove had burned low. The sea moved under the door. Tabby looked at their 2 hands on the whale jaw handle. His were marked from ropes and weather and the past 6 weeks of crate work. Hers were what they had always been, a working woman's hands. Calloused and stained. Smelling of salt and cedar and the particular dry ghost of Fujian wood smoke that she suspected she would carry for months. She had spent 3 years signing her work with a fish stamp because she knew what was said about a gentlewoman who traded. She had spent 3 years feeding her family in Sha. Repeating her father's knife and telling herself that the only approval she needed was the quality of the work. She had been right about all of that. She was also, she discovered, not made of stone, that is, she said. And had to stop and start again. That is an extremely unfair way to put a question to someone that I am aware. He was watching her face. I used the only materials I had. You used my own words against me. That I used your father's knife and 20 years of my worst habits and the smell of a Fujian smoke hoe. Se. He did not look away. Tabby. I am asking you plainly. Will you? Yes, she said. The word came out before she had finished deciding to say it, which was, she thought, probably the most honest thing she had done in years. The fire gave a small sound. The sea moved. He lifted her hand, both their hands still on the knife, and held it for a moment, and then he set the knife down very carefully on the record cloth, oriented the way she always kept it, blade folded. Handle toward her hand, Then he sat back and looked at her with an expression she finally had a word for: grateful. That was the word. Not triumphant, not relieved. Grateful. In the way of someone who has been given something they had genuinely believed they did not deserve, she looked at him looking at her and felt, somewhere under the cold air and the salt smell and the lingering ghost of old tobacco, something that had been wound tight for a very long time begin. Slowly and irrevocably, to loosen. What happens now? She said. Now, he said, I go to tell my grandmother, who already knows. Because she has known everything since approximately the third week and has been waiting with considerable impatience for the rest of us to catch up. Tabby thought about the dowager's stillness that afternoon. The cane not moving, she knew. She said, she knew. He stood up. He offered her his hand, not the way a man offers his hand to help a woman up, but the way two people who have just agreed to something shake hands, like partners confirming a contract. She sent me down here. She said you'd be here. And that I should stop performing grief at the sea door and go inside and say what I meant. Tabby looked at his hand, she took it, they walked back up to the house through the kitchen garden in the dark, and the cold came off the sea behind them. And she did not pull her coat tighter or apologize for the smell of her hands, and he did not offer her his arm or pretend he did not notice the smell. And it was nothing like the walk she had imagined and precisely what she had wanted. Lady Cairn left Foscote Park on a Saturday. She left in her well-sprung carriage with her luggage and her pearls and her folded paper. And the dowager watched her go from the upstairs window and said nothing to anyone about it for 3 days. On the 4th day she mentioned, over breakfast, that Bianca Cairn had accepted a small arrangement, a quarterly sum, access to the family's London house for 2 months a year, and a cottage near the Dorset border that had not been used in some years in exchange for removing herself from the county and developing, as the dowager put it, a sustained and sincere disinterest in this family's domestic arrangements. That I did not ruin her, the dowager said. When Tabby looked at her, I could have. The debts were extensive and the lawyer was thorough. But she married for bread when she might have married for better reasons, and she buried a man she did not love while she was still young enough to feel the waste of it. And she looked at you and saw everything she was promised and chose not to take. A sip of tea. There is punishment enough in that without my adding to it. Let her go and be comfortable somewhere far away. It costs us money, which we have, and silence, which we needed. She set down her cup. Now, she said, when is the wedding, and how long do you intend to make me wait for it? They were married in April, in the small grey church at the bottom of the Foscote Lane, where the churchyard ran to the cliff edge and you could hear the sea from the second pew. The dowager sat in the front pew, bolt upright, in her best black dress and her best jet beads, and cried steadily from the processional to the final blessing and denied it to anyone who was sufficiently unwise to mention it. Clara stood beside her sister in a new dress, not grand, but good wool, properly fitted, and held the small bunch of dried flowers that Tabby had made from the last of the Penang spicefish wrappings, which smelled of lemongrass and cedar and seemed to her entirely appropriate. Though she was the only person present who understood why old Curnow was in the fourth pew. He had come up from Kesterley on the carrier's cart, which his hip had just about managed. And he sat very straight and blew his nose twice during the vows and claimed afterward that the sea air had been sharp. At the church door, Perry took both of Tabby's hands in his. He had a ringgit, had been his grandmother's, and her mother's before her, worn thin and warm with the years. Sized down to fit a working woman's hand rather than a dowager's. He put it on her finger and held it there for a moment, his thumb over the whale-jaw callus on her third finger, the place where the knife handle rode. There, he said. Now the whole county can see it. He looked at her hand. God help the man who wed the fishwife. He is the most fortunate man on this coast, and he knows it, and he does not care one straw who knows that either. He had better not. Tabby said. There is a considerable amount of work still to do. The boathouse inventory had been complete since the second week of February. This was not the work she meant, and they both knew it. The boathouse was finished by midsummer, and it did not feel finished. Because a collection that is loved is never quite finished, and anyone who came into it felt immediately that it was loved. The sea door stood open most days now, bolted back against the stone wall to let in the harbor light and the salt air. The shelves along the three walls held the sorted and catalogued collection in good order: the Fujian abalone, the Nagasaki kelp, the Penang spice fish, the Lisbon salt cod. Each item in its cedar box with its record tag and its provenance and its preservation notes in Tabby's careful hand. The items too far gone to save had been documented and laid in a plain chest by the seawall, each with its own tag, mourned but not discarded. Because they had belonged to someone and that was worth recording. In a glass case by the window, where the morning light came strongest, lay the oilskin logbook open to the last entry: he did nothing wrong. The block seized: I am very proud of him. Beside it lay the pipe with the cracked stem, and the compass in its leather case, and a piece of waxed paper that had once wrapped a Fujian abalone and still, faintly, smelled of wood smoke, and beside those, on its own square of clean cloth, lay her father's knife. The whalejaw handle was worn to a high polish on the upper side. The blade was 3 inches, sharp as it had ever been. Below it, on a small card in Tabby's handwriting, were the words, "This tool belonged to Daniel Salt of Kesterly, fishmonger. It belongs now to Foscote Park. It has not lost anything in the change." Perry read in the boathouse most evenings, in the wooden chair by the sea door, a different chair, not the one from the corner, which had been moved to the house, with his father's logbook on the shelf nearest to hand and the smell of the harbor coming in on the evening tide. Tabby worked at the long table by the window, because there was always more work, and she was a woman who worked. And the Duchess of Foscote could do exactly as she pleased, and it pleased her to keep her trade. She had ordered a new stamp block from the Kesterly carver. The fish was the same as her father's. She had kept his design, the clean simple profile, the single line for the dorsal fin. But below it now, in small neat letters, the stamp read, T. Salt. Foscote, not a gentlewoman's name. Not only a fishmonger's daughter. Both. In the spring, the second spring, she was sitting in the boathouse with their son in her arms when the dowager came to find her. The boy was 6 weeks old and had Perry's coloring in her chin, which the dowager had already described as an exceptionally inconvenient combination, as it will make him both ungovernable and honest, and there is no cure for either. He had his hand wrapped around one of Tabby's fingers. He had been doing this for 6 weeks with the single-minded purposefulness that was, she was beginning to understand, simply the family manner in miniature. The dowager sat in the chair by the sea door and looked at the open logbook in its case, and the knife on its cloth, and the sorted shelves in the morning light, and the door standing wide to the harbor below. She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. "You saved more than the fish," she said finally. Tabby looked at her. "This house has been holding its breath since before you arrived." The old voice was lower than usual, and without its customary precision, the voice of someone saying something they have not rehearsed since long before. "My husband died and my son was never here long enough. And my grandson came back from the sea and locked the sea away, and we all pretended the smell of salt wasn't in every wall of the place." She looked at the open door, at the water below. "You came with a bag of tools and you opened every locked room in the house, and you did not ask any of us if we were ready," which was exactly right, because we would all have said no. The boy made a small sound and tightened his grip on Tabby's finger. "His great-grandfather," the dowager said, looking at him, "would have liked you very much. He liked people who paid attention to things properly." A pause. "He would have told you 16 things about the fishing grounds off this coast that you probably already know. You would have got along." Tabby looked down at the boy, at his hand around her finger. She thought about her father on the beach in the dark, holding the rope, holding the fish. She thought about her father's knife on its cloth, and his logbook on his shelf, and his notebook in her bag still worn, oil-stained, every page memorized, and the fish stamp, the same fish, pressed into the corner of every record she had ever made. She thought about the way the boathouse smelled in the morning when the sea door was open, salt and cedar, and faintly, always, the ghost of Fujian wood smoke. She thought about 3 seconds, outside. She heard Perry's step on the stone path, the particular rhythm of it, which she knew now the way she knew the sound of the tide. He came through the gate and down the path and in through the sea door, and he had been to the Kesterly market himself that morning because he had wanted to. And he was carrying a fish that he held it up. The man at the stall said it was fresh, he said. "I checked the gills." the dowager made a sound that might have been a laugh. Tabby looked at the fish. It was a good cod. Clear eyes. The gills were the right color, bright, clean. The particular red that meant caught this morning and iced properly since, yes, she said. It is that he set it on the workbench. In the place where her father's knife usually lay she had moved the knife to its case that morning and looked at her and the boy with an expression she had first seen in a boathouse on a winter evening when the fish stamp was still just a fish. And which she did not think she would ever have a better word for than the one she had found then. Grateful, the sea door stood open, the harbor light came in.